A billionaire married an obese woman and shocked high society. What no one expected was to discover the real reason behind this marriage. Betrayal, revenge, and a transformation that left everyone speechless. Stay until the end, because what this woman did with his fortune will surprise you completely. New York, 1980. The city that never sleeps was about to witness one of the most controversial marriages of the decade. Richard Donovan, 42 years old, heir to a textile empire valued at over $2 billion, had just announced his engagement. The news spread through the newspapers, social columns, exclusive clubs of Manhattan. Everyone wanted to know who was the lucky woman who had won the heart of the most coveted bachelor on the East Coast. When the first photos of Dorothy Miller appeared in the New York Times, the shock was instantaneous. Dorothy wasn't the thin and elegant model everyone expected. She didn't have the appearance of the socialites who usually hung on Richard's arm at charity events. Dorothy Miller was a 34-year-old woman, literature teacher at a public school in the Bronx, and weighed 286 pounds. The phones rang non-stop that March morning. Patricia Vanderbilt, Richard's ex-fiancée, whom he had dismissed 6 months earlier, almost dropped her coffee cup when she saw the photo. She immediately called her best friend, Constance Hughes. "Did you see it? Can you believe this? Richard Donovan is going to marry that woman. This has to be some kind of bet, some kind of bad joke." But it wasn't a joke. Richard Donovan was absolutely serious. He had met Dorothy at a bookstore in Greenwich Village 3 months earlier. She was looking for a vintage edition of Walt Whitman, and he happened to have seen the same book at an auction the week before. They started talking about poetry, about literature, about life. Richard was fascinated by Dorothy's intelligence, by the way she spoke about art and culture with a passion he had never seen in the women of his social circle. Dorothy was different from all the others. She didn't know who he was when they met, didn't recognize his last name, didn't ask questions about his fortune, didn't try to impress him with expensive clothes or jewelry. She wore simple dresses she bought at department stores, read used books, and shared a small apartment in Queens with 2 teacher colleagues. When Richard finally revealed who he was, Dorothy just shrugged and said that money didn't define a person. For the first time in his life, Richard felt seen as a human being, not as a walking bank account. He fell in love, madly, and 3 months later, he proposed to Dorothy at a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, far from the curious eyes of high society. But Richard's family didn't accept it so easily. His mother, Eleanor Donovan, a 68-year-old woman with white hair, always perfectly styled, and pearls always on her neck, almost had a heart attack when Richard brought Dorothy to dinner at the family mansion in Long Island. Eleanor could barely hide her disgust. Throughout the entire meal, she made subtle comments about health, about appearance, about how important it was to maintain certain standards when you were part of certain circles. Dorothy endured it all in silence, maintaining her dignified posture, responding politely when necessary. But Richard saw the pain in her eyes, saw how she squeezed the napkin in her lap every time his mother made another venomous comment. When they left that house, Richard held Dorothy's hand and said he would never take her there again, that if his family couldn't accept the woman he loved, then he would choose Dorothy over them. The wedding was set for June. Richard wanted something big, elegant, at the Plaza Hotel, but Dorothy insisted on something more intimate. They reached a compromise, and the ceremony would be in the garden of Richard's country house in Connecticut, only with close friends and some family members. Eleanor refused to attend. Richard's brothers, Thomas and Andrew, also made up last-minute excuses. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered that Richard was doing this out of rebellion, that he wanted to shock society, that he was going through some kind of midlife crisis. Patricia Vanderbilt, still bitter about the end of the engagement, spread a cruel rumor that Dorothy was pregnant and that Richard was being forced to marry. The rumor reached Dorothy's ears through one of the other teachers of the school where she worked. Dorothy cried that night, for the first time since she had met Richard. She looked at herself in the mirror of the tiny bathroom of the apartment in Queens and saw what everyone saw. A fat woman, outside the standard, unworthy of a billionaire. She almost called Richard that night to cancel everything, almost said that he deserved someone better, someone who wouldn't embarrass him, someone who wouldn't cause whispers and judgmental looks wherever they went. But then Richard showed up at her door without warning, with flowers in his hands and that smile that always melted her heart. "I heard what they're saying," Richard said, entering the apartment. "And I don't give a damn. Dorothy, you're the most incredible woman I've ever met. You're intelligent, kind, funny, passionate. You make me want to be a better person. I care about what you think, what you feel, not what those empty people say." Dorothy threw herself into his arms and cried, "But what if you regret it? What if one day you wake up and realize you could have had any woman in the world and chose ... I chose you, Richard interrupted firmly. And I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life. They'll talk, Dorothy. Let them talk. In the end, what matters is what exists between us, not what exists in the heads of strangers who know nothing about real love. The wedding day arrived. It was a sunny Saturday in June, the sky blue without clouds, the garden blooming and fragrant. Dorothy wore a simple white lace dress that she herself had chosen at a modest boutique in the Bronx. It didn't have an extravagant train, it didn't have gold embroidery, it didn't cost a fortune. But when Richard saw her walking toward him, his eyes filled with tears. She was radiant. Her long brown hair was loose, with small white flowers intertwined. Her face flushed with emotion, her brown eyes shining. She didn't look like a traditional fairy tale princess. But to Richard, she was the most beautiful woman in the world. The ceremony was small, but emotional. Only 20 people present. Dorothy's parents, a humble couple of Polish immigrants who worked at a bakery in the Bronx, cried with happiness. Some close friends of Richard who really knew him were there. And some of Dorothy's teacher colleagues who came to support her. When the justice of the peace asked if anyone had any objection to the matrimony, there was a heavy silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, a black limousine came roaring down the dirt road. The door opened and Eleanor Donovan stepped out, elegant as always in a light pink suit, a matching hat. Dorothy's heart sank. She was coming to stop the wedding, to humiliate her in front of everyone, to drag Richard back to reason. But Eleanor walked slowly to the front, her heels sinking slightly into the grass, and stood there, looking at Dorothy for a long moment. "I came here to say something," Eleanor began, her voice firm but not hostile. "I spent the last few months trying to understand why my son chose you. I tried to find the flaw in it, the logic, the hidden reason. I thought it was rebellion. I thought it was a phase. I thought it was anything but true love." Dorothy held the flower bouquet tightly, preparing for the worst. But Eleanor continued. "But then I saw something that changed my perspective. 2 weeks ago I followed you too." She paused, almost ashamed. "I know, it was terrible of me. But I needed to understand. And I saw you walking through Central Park. I saw how my son looked at you. I saw how he smiled, how he laughed, how he held your hand as if you were the most precious thing in the world. And I realized that in 42 years, I had never seen my son so happy, so complete, so himself." Tears began to roll down Eleanor's face, staining her impeccable makeup. "I was a fool, a vain and superficial fool, who almost destroyed my own son's happiness, because I cared more about what people would think than what he felt. Dorothy, I don't know you yet, but I want to know you. I want to understand what my son sees in you, and I want to welcome you to our family, if you'll give me that chance." Dorothy couldn't hold back the tears. Eleanor approached and, hesitantly, opened her arms. Dorothy stepped into the embrace, and the two women cried together while the guests applauded. Richard wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, too emotional to speak. The ceremony continued. They exchanged vows they had written themselves. Richard promised to love Dorothy every day, in joys and sorrows, in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty. Dorothy promised to be his partner, his confidant, his best friend, and to love him not for what he had, but for who he was. When they kissed as husband and wife, the applause echoed through the garden. It was a perfect moment. Simple, intimate, true. The reception was in the same garden. Tables decorated with wildflowers, homemade food prepared by Dorothy's mother and her aunts, live music from a small jazz band. Nothing extravagant, nothing ostentatious, but full of love and genuine joy. During the party, Patricia Vanderbilt showed up uninvited. She was visibly drunk, stumbling in her high heels, her flashy red dress totally inappropriate for the occasion. She marched straight to Dorothy, who was talking with some friends. "So you did it," Patricia said with a bitter laugh. "You caught the biggest prize, didn't you? You must be very proud of yourself. A fat teacher from the Bronx who hooked a billionaire. I bet you can't even believe your luck." Dorothy turned pale, but before she could respond, Richard appeared beside her. "You need to leave, Patricia, now." "Why?" Patricia challenged, her voice rising. "Because I'm telling the truth. Everyone here is thinking the same thing. You could have any woman in the world, Richard. Models, actresses, heiresses. And you chose this. She's not even pretty. She's fat, common, no class at all." Silence fell over the garden. Everyone stopped talking, eating, drinking. All attention turned to the scene. Dorothy felt her face burn with humiliation. She wanted to disappear, sink into the ground. But then something unexpected happened. Eleanor Donovan, the family matriarch, calmly walked up to Patricia. Without saying a word, Eleanor picked up a champagne glass from a nearby table and threw the contents in Patricia's face. "You were invited to leave?" Eleanor said coldly, her voice cutting like glass. "My son chose a woman with substance, with character, with a genuine heart. Something you clearly never had and never will. Now get off my property before I call security." Patricia stood there, dripping champagne, her face red with rage and humiliation. She looked around expecting support, but found only looks of reproach and disapproval. Finally, she turned and stumbled out, muttering unintelligible insults. The party slowly resumed. Dorothy was shaking, fighting not to cry. Richard wrapped her in his arms. "Don't let her ruin our day. She's not worth it." "But she's right," Dorothy whispered. "You could have anyone, ... "I have who I want," Richard said firmly, making her look into his eyes. "You're who I want, Dorothy. Today, tomorrow, always. And if it wasn't you, I'd rather be alone forever." The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Dorothy moved into Rich's penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, a huge space overlooking Central Park that was bigger than the entire school where she worked. She felt lost in that place, displaced among the designer furniture and expensive artwork. Richard noticed her discomfort and did something that completely surprised Dorothy. He sold the apartment. "Let's find a place that's ours," he said. "Not mine, not something I bought to impress investors and business colleagues. A place we choose together, that feels like a real home." They found a townhouse in Brooklyn, in a charming and quiet neighborhood. It wasn't as ostentatious as the penthouse, but it had a garden, it had natural light, it had personality. Dorothy decorated each room with love, mixing pieces she found at thrift stores, with some nice things Richard insisted on buying. The result was a cozy home, full of books, plants, and memories. Dorothy continued working as a teacher. Richard suggested she didn't need to work anymore, that she could do whatever she wanted, but Dorothy refused. "My students need me," she said. "And I need them. Teaching isn't just what I do, it's who I am." Richard admired that about her. The dedication, the purpose, the refusal to let money change who she fundamentally was. He started accompanying her sometimes, visiting the school, meeting the students. He was shocked by the precarious conditions, the lack of resources, the old and torn books, the absence of basic material. "This isn't right," Richard said one evening at dinner. "These children deserve better. They deserve the same opportunities that children in private schools have." "I know," Dorothy sighed. "But the public system doesn't have funding. We do what we can with what we have." Richard was silent for a moment, thinking. Then his eyes sparkled with an idea. What if we created a foundation? Something focused on public education, on providing resources for needy schools, scholarships for talented students, training for teachers. "We could make a real difference, Dorothy." And so the Miller Donovan Education Foundation was born. Richard initially invested $50 million, and Dorothy became the executive director. She stopped teaching to dedicate herself full-time to the project, but still visited schools regularly, talked with teachers, understood the real needs. The foundation transformed dozens of schools in just 2 years. Libraries were renovated, science labs were equipped, art programs were created, thousands of children received scholarships. Teachers received better salaries and professional development opportunities. Dorothy became known not as the fat wife of the billionaire, but as a powerful force in education. Newspapers that previously published photos of her with cruel captions now wrote laudatory articles about her work. She was invited to speak at conferences, to advise politicians, to lead national initiatives. And something else started to happen. Dorothy started to lose weight. Not because Richard asked, not because society demanded, but because she was happy. She was busy, fulfilled, passionate about the work she did. She started walking every morning with Richard through the park, not as exercise, but as time together. She started cooking healthy meals at home because she loved experimenting with new recipes. In 3 years, Dorothy lost over 130 pounds. But more importantly, she gained confidence, purpose, and a powerful voice in the world. People who previously judged her by appearance now respected her for her achievements. And Richard loved her exactly the same way he always loved her. Because for him, the size of her body never defined the size of her heart. Eleanor Donovan became one of the foundation's biggest supporters. She and Dorothy developed a close relationship, almost maternal. Eleanor admitted in an interview years later that Dorothy had taught her valuable lessons about value, about superficiality, about what really matters in life. "I spent 70 years worried about appearances," Eleanor said. About what people thought, about maintaining certain standards, about fitting into society's expectations. Dorothy showed me that all of that is empty. That the true value of a person is in their character, in their kindness, in what they contribute to the world. My son knew that when he chose her, I was the last to learn. Patricia Vanderbilt, on the other hand, never recovered from the humiliation. She tried for years to win Richard back, spread more rumors about Dorothy, but no one paid attention anymore. Eventually she married an older businessman for convenience and spent the rest of her life bitter and unhappy, always looking from afar at the happiness she could have had if she wasn't so superficial. 5 years after the wedding, Dorothy and Richard were honored at a charity dinner at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. More than 500 people attended, including politicians, celebrities, educators, philanthropists. Dorothy went up on stage to give the thank you speech, and Richard sat in the front row, looking at her with the same love and admiration as the first day. When I met my husband 5 years ago, Dorothy began, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the hall. I was a simple teacher who just wanted to buy a poetry book. I never imagined that casual encounter would change my life in so many ways. Not because of the money, not because of the status, but because I found someone who saw me, who saw beyond appearance, beyond society's expectations, beyond everything that is superficial. He saw me for who I really was, and decided that was enough. Actually, more than enough. She paused, her eyes meeting Richard's. Many people judged our marriage. They said it wouldn't last, that it was a mistake, that we were incompatible. And maybe, by the traditional standards of high society, they were right. But we created our own standards. Standards based on mutual respect, on shared goals, on true love. And together, we built something bigger than ourselves. We built hope for thousands of children. We built opportunities where before, there were only limitations. The hall exploded in applause. People stood up, giving an ovation. Dorothy came down from the stage and went straight to Richard, who was waiting for her with open arms. They hugged in the middle of all that noise and celebration. But for them, in that moment, only the two of them existed. 10 years after the wedding, Dorothy was pregnant. Doctors had said it would be difficult to get pregnant at her age, especially considering the history of health problems related to her previous weight. But at 44 years old, Dorothy was carrying a life inside her, a miracle that she and Richard never thought they would have. When their son was born, a healthy boy with blue eyes from his father and dark hair from his mother, they named him Michael. Michael Thomas Donovan grew up in a home full of love, surrounded by books, education, and strong values. He never knew a time when his parents were judged or ridiculed. For him, they were simply mom and dad, two people who loved each other deeply and dedicated their lives to helping others. Eleanor Donovan held her grandson in her arms and cried tears of joy. "I almost lost all of this," she whispered to Dorothy. "I almost lost my son, my grandson, you, everything, because of foolish pride. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Thank you for showing me what really matters." The Miller Donovan Foundation continued to grow. By Dorothy and Richard's 20th wedding anniversary, it had impacted more than 1 million children across the country. Entire schools were transformed. Generations of students had access to opportunities they would never have had otherwise. And it all started because a fat woman from the Bronx refused to let the judgments of others define her worth. In an interview on their 30th wedding anniversary, a journalist asked Richard if he ever regretted his choice. Richard looked at Dorothy, now 64 years old, hair grayer but eyes still bright and full of life, and smiled. "Regret," he said. "My only regret is not having met her earlier. Dorothy wasn't just the best choice I made in my life. She was the only choice that really mattered. Everything I built, all the companies, all the money, none of that has meaning compared to what we built together. A legacy of love, of education, of making a real difference in the world. That's what matters. And that was only possible because of her." Dorothy took his hand and squeezed it. "We saved each other," she said softly. "I saved him from an empty life surrounded by superficial people. And he saved me from believing I didn't deserve to be loved, that my appearance defined my worth. Together, we discovered that true love has nothing to do with appearance, with status, with what others think. It has to do with finding someone who sees your soul and chooses to stay, every day, no matter what happens." The story of Richard and Dorothy Donovan became legendary. Not as the billionaire who married the fat woman, as an act of charity or rebellion, but as two human beings who met, truly loved each other, and used their combined resources to make the world a better place. They proved that real love transcends appearances, that character matters more than beauty, and that the most powerful partnerships are those based on mutual respect and shared values. Years later, on his deathbed, at 89 years old, Richard held Dorothy's hand for the last time. His son Michael was there, along with his 3 grandchildren. His family, his legacy, everything that really mattered. "You made my life worth living," Richard whispered to Dorothy, his voice weak, but full of emotion. "Every second with you was a gift. And you taught me that I was always enough," Dorothy responded, tears running down her face. "Exactly as I was." Richard Donovan died peacefully that night, a completely fulfilled man. And when Dorothy followed him 3 years later, she was buried beside him with a simple inscription on her tombstone. She taught us that love sees with the heart, not with the eyes. The Miller Donovan Foundation continues operating to this day, now managed by Michael and his family, continuing his parents' legacy. And in every school they renovate, in every child they help, lives the proof that a marriage that shocked society became one of the greatest love stories and social impact in modern history. Because in the end, Richard Donovan didn't marry an obese woman. He married Dorothy Miller, an extraordinary woman who changed his life, his perspective, and the world around them. And that, more than any fortune, is the true meaning of wealth. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever judged someone by their appearance, and then discovered how wrong you were? Or maybe you were judged unfairly and proved you were much more than people thought. Share your story in the comments, because these experiences connect us and remind us to look beyond the superficial. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that show that true love and value go far beyond appearances.